I held the heavy brass pen my father had just forced into my hand. Across the mahogany desk, he tapped the crystal face of his watch, visibly annoyed that stealing my $3 million inheritance was cutting into his morning schedule. He told me it was just a routine tax document. He smiled at his hired notary, thinking he had just robbed his invisible younger daughter blind on the morning of her 18th birthday. He thought I was just the quiet, compliant spare who would sign anything he put in front of me. He had no idea the silent man standing in the corner was actually an undercover federal agent building a wire fraud case against him. Welcome back to QT Told Stories, where quiet women finally stop paying the price for their family's greed. My name is Fiona Adelaide. I am 18 years old and I fix broken timepieces for a living. Drop a comment below, tell me your age, and be sure to subscribe. To understand why my father believed I would sign away my entire future without reading the fine print, you have to understand the house I grew up in. The Adelaide name carries a specific currency in New York. My father, Richard, runs a hedge fund that specializes in corporate acquisitions. He identifies vulnerable companies, strips them of their value, and leaves the empty shells behind. My mother, Sylvia, treats Upper East Side society like a chessboard, moving alliances and curating galas with lethal precision. Then there is my older sister, Victoria. She is the flawless heir apparent, a glittering socialite who wears the family ambition like a second skin. I was born the spare. In a family where every interaction is a calculated transaction, I chose to be invisible. I cultivated that invisibility carefully, fading into the background, perfectly content to let Victoria catch the blinding glare of our parents' expectations. I preferred the quiet of the third-floor townhouse, where I apprenticed under a master horologist, learning to restore vintage watches. The work required microscopic patience. It taught me how to look for the tiny frictions that indicate a failing system. My grandmother was the only person who understood the toll my family took on a person. Before she passed, she established a trust in my name, $3 million locked away, scheduled to transfer to my sole control the day I turned 18. It was my exit strategy, a financial shield forged by the only relative who despised the Wall Street circus as much as I did. This morning, the day of my 18th birthday, I sat hunched over my workbench with a jeweler's loupe pressed to my eye. I was reassembling the delicate balance spring of a vintage mechanical watch. Inside my workspace, time was measured and rational. The heavy oak door swung open without a knock. The sudden draft snuffed the small flame of my alcohol lamp. I set my titanium tweezers down onto the felt mat and turned around. My father stood in the doorway. He never came up to the third floor. The air shifted immediately thick with the sharp scent of his expensive cologne and bitter espresso. He wore a tailored navy suit, but something was wrong with the picture. The knot of his silk tie was pulled down half an inch. A faint sheen of sweat clung to his temples. Richard Adelaide did not sweat, not when the market dipped, and never in his own home. He stepped forward, his leather shoes silent on the rug, and dropped a thick manila folder onto my workbench. It landed inches from the fragile gears. He did not say happy birthday. His voice carried a forced, hollow lightness. I need your signature, Fiona. I glanced at the yellow sticky tabs protruding from the edges of the pages. On what? Routine tax forms, he replied, adjusting his cuffs in a rapid, jerky motion. Standard procedure for dependents reaching the age of majority. The accountants are closing the quarterly filings this afternoon, and we need to update the household disclosures. He checked his watch. The gesture was too fast. It was a physical manifestation of an adrenaline spike. My father was bleeding panic, hiding it behind a thin veneer of annoyance. I can read through them tonight, I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat. No, he snapped. The hollow lightness evaporated, replaced by the rigid authority he used to break junior analysts. He caught himself exhaling a sharp breath. The courier is waiting downstairs. I have a personal notary set up in the library right now. It takes 2 minutes, Fiona. Let us just get it handled. A notary. In the house. For routine tax forms on a Tuesday morning. My training taught me to observe the alignment of gears. The system standing in front of me was buckling under a weight I could not yet see. I stood up and brushed a speck of dust from my jeans. I followed him down the sweeping staircase to the first floor. The library was paneled in dark mahogany and smelled of old paper and furniture wax. A broad-shouldered man in a plain gray suit stood near the window, holding a leather folio. My father introduced him as Wyatt Davis, a trusted independent notary. I sat down in the leather chair across from my father's desk. He slid the folder toward me and uncapped a heavy brass pen. "Just sign where the yellow tabs are," my father said, tapping the desk. I opened the folder. The document was dense with legal jargon, but my eyes caught the bold text near the top of the second page. It was not a tax disclosure. It was a total relinquishment of assets. A binding transfer of a $3 million trust granting Richard Adelaide full power of attorney. I looked up. I was prepared to refuse to slide the paper back across the desk and walk out the front door. But as I lifted my head, my eyes met the gaze of Wyatt Davis. The notary did not look away. Instead, he performed a highly deliberate, unnatural motion. He reached up and tapped his lapel, pulling the fabric back just enough to reveal the edge of a federal badge pinned inside his jacket. Then he gave me a microscopic grounding nod. The air in the room grew very cold and very clear. He was not a notary. My father was not just stealing my money, my father was a target. The brass pen rested heavy between my fingers. The ink cartridge inside was fresh, waiting to bind my entire future to the man hovering across the desk. My father tapped his index finger against the leather blotter, a rhythmic, anxious beat that disrupted the quiet of the room. I kept my eyes focused on the crisp white paper, calculating the variables. The bold text of the relinquishment clause blurred for a fraction of a second, then sharpened into perfect focus. Power of attorney, irrevocable transfer. He was stealing my exit strategy. But the real friction in the room did not belong to him. It belonged to the man standing near the window. Wyatt Davis. The notary who was not a notary, the flash of the federal seal beneath his suit jacket lingered in my mind like an afterimage. It changed the entire geometry of the room. If my father were simply a thief, I would have set the pen down, walked out the front door, and hailed a cab to an estate lawyer. I would have fought him in probate court and let the tabloids feast on the Adelaide family drama. But a federal agent standing silently in our library meant the theft was already being monitored. It meant my father was walking blindly into a snare. "Fiona," my father said, his tone dipping into that practiced, condescending register he used when a junior partner failed to grasp a concept fast enough. "We are on a schedule. Just sign the yellow markers. The accountants are waiting." He leaned forward, casting a shadow over the document. The library we sat in was a monument to his ego. First edition books he never read lined the shelves, acting as expensive wallpaper. Framed articles from financial magazines celebrated his most ruthless corporate raids. Growing up, Richard Adelaide treated his children exactly like the companies he acquired. We were assets on a balance sheet. Victoria was his blue-chip stock, yielding high social dividends through her elite networking and flawless appearances. I was the dead capital. He never bothered to teach me about trusts or offshore accounts because he assumed I lacked the intellect to understand them. He confused my preference for quiet restoration with a lack of ambition. That assumption was his fatal flaw. He believed I would look at a binding legal transfer and see only a stack of boring tax disclosures. If he had asked Victoria to sign a blind document, she would have demanded a luxury vacation or a diamond tennis bracelet in exchange for her cooperation. I never asked for anything. That made me the perfect mark. I traced the edge of the paper with my thumb. The room felt suddenly unventilated. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked a steady, unyielding rhythm that mirrored the beating in my own chest. My father checked his watch again. The veneer of his control was wearing thin, exposing the raw, frantic need underneath. Whatever trouble his hedge fund was in, it required $3 million to patch the leak by the end of the business day. That money was supposed to be my freedom. It was the capital I needed to open my own horology shop in Brooklyn, far away from the suffocating expectations of the Upper East Side. He was asking me to fund his survival with my independence. I lifted my gaze from the page and looked at Wyatt. He stood with the relaxed posture of a man accustomed to observing desperate people. He did not break eye contact. There was a strange gravity to his stillness. In the span of 3 seconds, a silent dialogue passed between us. If I refused to sign, my father would panic. He would call his lawyers, shred documents, and bury whatever paper trail the agent was tracking. The trap would snap shut on empty air. My father would escape, and I would spend years fighting him in civil court for a trust fund he would likely drain through legal fees anyway. But if I signed, I was willingly surrendering the only wealth I had ever called my own. I was handing my father the key to my grandmother's vault. Wyatt offered another microscopic tilt of his chin. It was a command disguised as a gesture. Trust the process. In my trade, when a delicate mechanism is jammed, you do not force the gear backward. You let the tension run its course until the spring unwinds, safely exposing the core of the problem. I lowered my eyes back to the signature line. The brass pen felt cold against my skin. I steadied my breathing, isolating the muscles in my hand the way I did when setting a microscopic jewel into a watch face. I pressed the nib to the paper. The ink flowed smooth and dark. I wrote my name with careful, fluid strokes. First the authorization line, then the transfer consent, then the final waiver of rights. My handwriting did not shake. It was identical to the signature I used to sign for parts deliveries, ordinary and unassuming. The moment the pen lifted from the final yellow tab, my father snatched the folder. The transformation was instantaneous. The frantic energy vanished, replaced by a deep, hollow sigh of relief. He did not bother to review the pages carefully. He had what he needed. His posture straightened, and the mask of the elite Manhattan financier slid perfectly back into place. "Good girl," he murmured, already turning toward the door. "I will have the accountants finalize everything. Go back to your clocks." He dismissed me without another glance, treating my life savings like a minor administrative hurdle he had successfully navigated before lunch. He walked over to Wyatt, handing him the folder. "Stamp these and leave them on the credenza," my father instructed, his voice regaining its usual arrogant timbre. Wyatt took the folder with a polite professional nod. He carried his leather folio to a small side table and retrieved a heavy metal notary stamp and began impressing the pages. The loud thud of the stamp echoed in the mahogany room. My father had already moved to his wet bar, pouring a measure of scotch into a crystal tumbler to celebrate his victory. I stood up from the leather chair, my knees feeling unnaturally light. The reality of what I had just done weighed heavily on my shoulders, yet my mind was racing with newfound clarity. I walked toward the doorway, passing by the side table where Wyatt was working. As I stepped past him, he extended his hand to return my brass pen. Tucked beneath the barrel of the pen was a small, plain white business card. I took the pen and the card in one seamless motion, utilizing the sleight of hand I had developed handling tiny watch components. I slipped both items into the front pocket of my jeans. "Thank you for your time, Miss Adelaide," Wyatt said, his voice an even unremarkable baritone. "Have a nice day," I replied, keeping my face entirely blank. I walked out into the marble hallway and did not stop until I reached the safety of my third-floor studio. I locked the heavy oak door behind me. The noise of the city outside seemed muffled, distant. I sat on my stool, the familiar scent of clock oil and brass washing over me, and pulled the card from my pocket. It was blank on the front. On the back, a 10-digit phone number was scribbled in blue ink. No name, no agency seal, just a burner line. I stared at the numbers, the implications cascading through my mind. My father was not just a thief who had robbed his 18-year-old daughter. He was the target of a federal investigation, and I had just funded his getaway car. The money my grandmother left me was now the bait in a trap I did not fully understand. I reached for my jeweler's loop, my fingers craving the familiar routine of intricate work, but my focus was gone. The quiet life I had built in this room was over. The afternoon sun slipped behind the Manhattan skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across my workbench. I sat perfectly still with the white business card resting on my palm. My father had taken my inheritance. That was a fact, solid and heavy. But in horology, a broken mainspring is never the whole story. You have to trace the kinetic energy backward to understand why the metal snapped. Why today? Why risk a federal crime for a sum that in my father's circles was merely the price of a midtown penthouse? Downstairs, our townhouse was transforming into a theater. Victoria was getting engaged. The event was billed as a celebration of love, but anyone who understood the Adelaide family knew it was a corporate mixer disguised in tulle and expensive champagne. Dozens of florists carried towering arrangements of white hydrangeas through the foyer. Catering staff in crisp uniforms arranged crystal glasses on silver trays. I stepped out of my studio and leaned over the mahogany banister. From the third-floor landing, I watched the chaotic ballet below. My mother Sylvia stood in the center of the marble atrium, directing the staff with the precision of a general orchestrating a siege. Sylvia curated our reality. She believed that if a problem could not be photographed, it did not exist. She spotted me lingering on the stairs, and her posture stiffened. "Fiona!" she called out, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The photographers from the society pages arrive at 7. Please remain upstairs once the guests start arriving. We need the staging areas clear of clutter." She waved her hand dismissively, pointing toward the upper floor with the stem of an unclipped lily. She did not look at my face. She looked at my faded jeans and the faint smudge of clock oil on my collar. In her eyes, I was not a daughter participating in a family milestone. I was an unsightly prop, ruining the aesthetic of her curated exhibit. I nodded and retreated down the hallway, the familiar sting of rejection replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. Her dismissal provided the missing variable in my equation. The Adelaide household was projecting an illusion of flawless prosperity, right as my father committed grand larceny in his own library. I went into my bedroom and opened my laptop. I pulled up the financial news feeds I usually ignored. Richard Adelaide's hedge fund was the top headline. His firm was days away from finalizing a high-stakes merger with a European conglomerate. The articles praised his ruthless market strategies and predicted a seamless acquisition by Friday. I closed my eyes and pictured my father standing in my studio. The loosened silk tie, the frantic glance at his platinum watch, the sweat on his temples. He was not a man celebrating a victory. He was a man drowning in a tailored suit. The math crystallized in my mind. The merger required total financial transparency. The European firm would demand an audit of his books by the Securities and Exchange Commission before transferring their assets. If my father needed $3 million liquid, untraceable, and immediate, it meant he was hiding a fatal liquidity crisis. He was bleeding capital. The money my grandmother left me was not stolen out of greed. It was stolen out of sheer, unadulterated panic. He needed my trust fund to plug a gaping hole in an offshore shell company before the auditors arrived and discovered his empire was built on air. I closed the laptop, the soft click echoing in the quiet room. The bedroom door opened without warning. Victoria leaned against the frame, holding a crystal flute of sparkling water. She wore a silk dressing gown, her hair pinned up in elaborate curls. My sister existed in a state of perpetual performance. She thrived on the adrenaline of being desired, always maneuvering to ensure she remained the focal point of every room. "It is a madhouse down there," Victoria sighed, taking a delicate sip from her glass. "The ice sculptures alone took 3 hours to install." She walked further into my room, picking up the dial of a vintage pocket watch I had left on my dresser, inspecting it with feigned interest before setting it down carelessly. "Dad is being so generous with all of this," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the downstairs commotion. "He just wired an extra $50,000 to the caterers because I wanted the imported caviar. He said my future is his best investment." She smiled, a bright, blinding expression devoid of any real warmth. She looked around my modest room, a space devoid of designer labels or expensive art, and her smile softened into pity. "You should come down for a few minutes tonight, Fiona. Just stand in the back. Maybe some of that ambition will rub off on you." I looked at my sister, the diamonds winking on her ears, the smug satisfaction radiating from her posture. She was entirely oblivious to the reality sustaining her luxury. Or worse, she was complicit, content to ignore the bodies buried under her ballroom floor as long as the music kept playing. My father was funding her imported caviar with the money meant to buy my freedom. He was purchasing her elite status by sacrificing my independence. The final gear clicked into place. I saw my lifelong role with devastating clarity. I was never a daughter to them. I was a contingency plan, a silent, unassuming reserve tank kept in the dark, waiting to be tapped the moment their glittering machinery ran out of fuel. They had spent 18 years treating me as invisible, assuming my quiet compliance meant I lacked a spine. They thought I would quietly absorb the theft and thank them for the privilege of keeping a roof over my head. Victoria set her glass on my nightstand, leaving a ring of condensation on the wood. "Wear something presentable if you do come down," she murmured, turning on her heel and exiting the room. I stood alone in the silence. The business card in my pocket felt heavy, pulling at the fabric of my jeans. My family had orchestrated a masterpiece of deception. They had built an empire on lies, theft, and the assumption that I would always play the obedient victim. But a watchmaker knows that even the most complex, expensive mechanisms can be brought to a grinding halt by introducing a single grain of sand into the mainspring. I grabbed my jacket and a handful of quarters from my desk drawer. I slipped out the back staircase, avoiding the catering crews and florists crowding the kitchen. The evening air hit my face crisp and carrying the scent of exhaust and roasting nuts from a nearby street cart. I walked for 14 blocks, leaving the manicured sidewalks of the Upper East Side behind. I needed a location off the grid somewhere. My father's security cameras and socialites could not track me. I found an old neon-lit diner on a quiet corner in Midtown. The interior smelled of stale coffee and fried potatoes. A few tired patrons sat huddled over their mugs in the vinyl booths. In the back hallway, near the restrooms, a battered payphone clung to the tiled wall. It was a relic of a forgotten era, much like the timepieces I restored. I picked up the heavy plastic receiver. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, a steady electric pulse. I fished the quarters from my pocket and fed them into the slot. The coins dropped with a series of sharp metallic clangs. I pulled the white business card from my pocket and smoothed it flat against the metal casing of the phone. I dialed the 10-digit burner number Wyatt Davis had written on the back. Each press of the keypad severed a tie to the family that had discarded me. The line rang once, twice. "Speak." A deep, even voice answered. I gripped the receiver, my knuckles turning white, and stepped permanently over the line from victim to informant. "My name is Fiona Adelaide," I said, my voice steady in the dim hallway. "You were in my library this morning. Tell me how to tear his company apart." The payphone receiver felt heavy as I placed it back on its metal hook. The voice on the other end had given me a time and an intersection. 40 minutes later, I walked down a concrete stairwell into the basement archives of the main public library. The air down there was thick with the scent of decaying paper and industrial floor wax. It felt remarkably similar to my watchmaker studio, a place where time was cataloged and forgotten by the city above. I walked past row upon row of steel shelving that stretched into the dim fluorescent light. My boots made soft thuds against the linoleum. Wyatt Davis stood at the end of the third corridor. He no longer wore the cheap gray suit from my father's library. He wore a dark windbreaker and carried a quiet, undeniable authority. The submissive posture of a hired notary was entirely gone. He gestured toward a battered wooden reading table. I sat down across from him. He did not offer a comforting smile or a sympathetic greeting. I appreciated the lack of pity. Pity is a useless emotion when the gears of a trap are already turning. Wyatt opened a plain manila folder. It looked identical to the one my father had dropped on my workbench that morning. The irony was sharp. My father used a folder to steal my future, and a federal agent was using one to hand it back. He laid out the reality of my family name. Richard Adelaide was not just a ruthless hedge fund manager. He was the center of a sweeping 3-year investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The charges included systemic corporate fraud, widespread insider trading, and the embezzlement of pension funds from the companies he dismantled. The problem, Wyatt explained, was my father's meticulous nature. Richard treated his illicit finances like a hermetically sealed watch movement. He operated through a labyrinth of proxy boards, shell companies, and Cayman Islands holding accounts. He never left a direct paper trail. Every time the Bureau got close to a subpoena, the offshore accounts would dissolve, the digital ledgers would wipe clean, and the money would vanish into the ether. The investigators needed a direct link. They needed a domestic wire transfer authorized by a member of the Adelaide household flowing straight into the offshore network. Wyatt pointed to a photocopy of the document I had signed hours ago. My signature sat stark and undeniable on the page. He told me the trust fund relinquishment was not just a theft, it was the exact wire transfer the FBI had been waiting for. My grandmother's money was going to be routed directly into the primary shell company my father used to hide his embezzled assets. The moment those funds landed in the offshore account, it would create a permanent federal bridge. The Bureau could finally track the digital footprints, secure the warrants, and blow the entire criminal network wide open. But there was a catch. International wire transfers of that magnitude require a specific clearing window, 5 days. Wyatt folded his hands on the wooden table and outlined the new parameters of my reality. For the next 5 days, I had to act as the inside informant. I had to walk back into the townhouse and play my role flawlessly. I had to endure my mother treating me like a stray dog. I had to watch my sister flaunt the luxury purchased with my stolen inheritance. I had to sit across the dinner table from a man who viewed me as nothing more than an emergency reserve of capital. If I showed a single hint of defiance, the operation would fail. Richard was a paranoid man. If he sensed any shift in my usual compliant demeanor, he would assume I had spoken to an estate lawyer. He would immediately scrub the servers, abort the upcoming European merger, and flee the country before the wire cleared. I had to remain the dumb, invisible teenager. I had to let them think they had won. The psychological weight of the assignment settled over me. I had spent 18 years fading into the background because it was the only way to survive the Adelaide household. Now I had to weaponize that same invisibility. I had to use the very trauma they inflicted on me to engineer their downfall. Wyatt studied my face. He was an agent trained to read hesitation, and he must have seen the silent calculus running behind my eyes. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a cell phone. He placed the device on the table between us. He offered me a way out. He explained that he could make one phone call to a federal judge right now. He could freeze the domestic account before the wire initiation processed. My $3 million would be secured. I could walk away, rent a quiet apartment in Brooklyn, and open my horology shop. I would be safe, and my grandmother's legacy would remain intact. But he warned if we froze the transfer, the investigation would hit a dead end. My father would realize the federal government was watching his domestic accounts. He would close the offshore shells and walk free. The family empire would survive. Victoria would marry her billionaire fiancé. My mother would continue to rule the Upper East Side, and Richard Adelaide would find another victim to strip for parts. I looked at the black screen of the cell phone. The choice was binary, like the ticking of a quartz escapement. Save myself and let the toxic machine keep running, or sacrifice the only leverage I had to break the machine entirely. My grandmother had left me that money to protect me from them. She wanted me to have a quiet, peaceful life. But a peaceful life built in the shadow of their unpunished greed felt like a hollow victory. They had treated me as a discardable asset since the day I was born. They had assumed my silence was a symptom of stupidity. I did not want to just escape them anymore. I wanted them to see exactly who they had underestimated. I pushed the cell phone back across the scratched wooden table. The plastic slid with a soft scraping sound. I looked Wyatt in the eye. I told him I did not want the safe route. I told him my father had spent his entire career treating people like collateral damage, and it was time he understood the math of his own actions. The $3 million would serve as the bait. I was willing to risk every cent of my grandmother's gift to build the snare. I would walk back into the penthouse. I would smile at my sister. I would nod at my mother. I would be the most obedient daughter Richard Adelaide had ever known, right up until the moment the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Wyatt did not smile, but a glint of genuine respect softened his sharp features. He picked up the phone and placed it back inside his jacket. He briefed me on the communication protocols. We would not speak directly. If the situation escalated, I was to use the burner number, let it ring twice, and hang up. He gave me a brief tutorial on recognizing digital surveillance and instructed me to memorize the layout of my father's home office. The meeting concluded without a handshake. In this new world, physical contact was an unnecessary risk. I stood up from the wooden chair, the legs scraping against the linoleum floor. I walked back down the aisles of the library basement, leaving the dust and the silence behind. I stepped out onto the busy Manhattan street. The evening air was cold, biting through my thin jacket. The city moved around me in a blur of yellow cabs and rushing pedestrians. I hailed a taxi to take me back to the Upper East Side. I needed to return to the townhouse before my absence was noticed by the catering staff. I sat in the back seat, watching the streetlights bleed across the tinted window, preparing my mind for the performance of a lifetime. I was no longer just the quiet apprentice restoring broken watches. I was the architect of my family's ruin, and the countdown had just begun. I paid the driver and stepped onto the pristine sidewalk in front of my home. The grand facade of the Adelaide townhouse loomed above me, windows blazing with light. I took a deep breath, smoothing my expression into a mask of perfect, docile compliance. I turned the brass handle of the front door and walked back into the cage. The heavy brass handle of the front door yielded to my touch, and I stepped from the chill of the Manhattan evening into the suffocating warmth of the Adelaide townhouse. The foyer was a hive of frantic motion. Floral designers barked orders at assistants carrying enormous vases of white orchids. Catering managers cross-checked inventory lists on glowing tablets, their voices a low drone of logistics. I kept my posture relaxed, mimicking the invisible docile spare they all expected to see. I moved through the marble corridors, sidestepping a tower of crystal champagne flutes, making my way toward the back service stairs. My route required passing through the main kitchen. The kitchen in our home was a sterile, industrial space designed for private chefs rather than family meals. Tonight, it served as the command center for Victoria's engagement gala. I pushed open the swinging door and froze. My mother Sylvia stood by the stainless steel island. She was dismissing a nervous pastry chef with a flick of her manicured hand. Sylvia Adelaide possessed the instincts of an apex predator. She did not merely look at a room, she audited it, scanning for vulnerabilities and shifting loyalties. Her social currency was built on detecting weakness, a skill she honed over decades of navigating Upper East Side power struggles. Before she married my father, she had been a struggling gallery assistant who clawed her way into high society through sheer, unyielding calculation. She survived by ensuring she was always the most dangerous person in the room. As the chef scurried away, Sylvia turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes narrowed. Usually when my mother looked at me, I lowered my chin. I would shift my weight, fold my arms, and present the physical manifestation of an apology for simply existing. It was a survival mechanism etched into my muscle memory since childhood. But standing in the library earlier that day, making a pact with a federal agent, had severed that neural pathway. The spell was broken. I stood tall, keeping my hands resting easily at my sides. I met her gaze without blinking. Sylvia noticed the absence of my flinch. A fractional tightening of her jaw betrayed her unease. She walked slowly around the kitchen island, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic tempo against the imported tile. She dismissed the remaining staff with a single sharp word, leaving us alone in the cavernous room. "Where have you been, Fiona?" she asked, her tone conversational but laced with a lethal undertow. "Taking a walk," I replied, keeping my voice mild and unbothered. "I needed some fresh air." She stopped a few feet away from me, invading my personal space. She reached out and straightened the collar of my jacket, a maternal gesture that felt like a threat. "You have seemed distant today," Sylvia murmured, her eyes searching my face for microscopic cracks. "Your father told me about the paperwork you signed this morning. I hope you are not harboring any foolish resentment. We are protecting you, darling." I let the word hang in the air. Protecting. "Protecting me from what?" I asked softly. Sylvia offered a patronizing smile. "From the burden of things you cannot comprehend. You are a simple girl, Fiona. You prefer your little clocks in your quiet room. Wealth of that magnitude requires a certain fortitude, a strategic mind. You do not possess the constitution to manage a trust fund. We are shielding you from the vultures who would take advantage of your naive disposition." She was weaving the narrative, spinning the theft of my $3 million into an act of parental mercy. It was textbook emotional manipulation, a tactic she had perfected over 18 years to keep me docile and compliant. "I understand," I said, offering a practiced vacant nod. But Sylvia was not satisfied. The predatory instinct in her recognized that my compliance lacked its usual desperate sincerity. She stepped closer, her voice dropping into a harsh warning whisper. "Listen to me very carefully," she said, dropping a veneer of the caring mother. "Your father is securing a merger this week that will define the legacy of this family. Victoria is marrying a man who will elevate our standing to a level you cannot even fathom. The Adelaide name is about to become untouchable. Do not think even for a moment that you can jeopardize this." She gripped my chin, forcing me to maintain eye contact. Her nails dug into my skin. "If you cause any trouble, if you speak to a lawyer, or if you attempt to embarrass us during this critical week, I will cut you off entirely. You will be exiled from this city. I will personally ensure that every door in New York is locked to you. Furthermore, I will have our family physicians draft a statement detailing your deteriorating mental stability. You will be institutionalized, Fiona. Do you understand the scope of what I can do to you?" The threat was not an idle boast. Sylvia possessed the connections and the cruelty to execute every word. She would gladly destroy my reputation and my freedom to protect her social empire. I kept my expression entirely neutral, absorbing the venom without reacting. I did not pull my chin away. I simply stared back at her, letting my eyes reflect nothing but empty obedience. "I understand, Mom," I whispered. Sylvia searched my eyes for another long second, looking for rebellion. Finding none, she released my chin with a satisfied sigh. She turned her back to me, reaching for a porcelain teacup resting on the edge of the counter. Her hand brushed the saucer too harshly. The delicate cup tumbled over the edge and shattered into dozens of sharp fragments against the hard floor. We both looked at the broken porcelain. In a normal household, a person would fetch a broom and carefully sweep up the mess. Sylvia did not call for the staff, nor did she reach for a dustpan. She simply extended her foot and kicked the jagged pieces under the deep overhang of the custom cabinetry, hiding the destruction in the shadows where it could not be easily seen. It was a perfect encapsulation of how my mother handled the sins of our family. She swept the wreckage out of sight, prioritizing the flawless surface over the rot accumulating underneath. "Go to your room," Sylvia instructed, dusting her hands together. She walked toward the wall-mounted security panel near the pantry door. "I am locking down the catering wing for the night." I turned toward the service stairs, but I kept my peripheral vision locked on her movements. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers dance across the illuminated keypad. 4792. She pressed the enter key and a soft chime confirmed the engagement of the internal locks. She had just handed me the keys to the castle. I walked up the narrow stairs to my bedroom, the threat of exile ringing in my ears. I sat on the edge of my mattress and waited. I listened to the sounds of the townhouse slowly dying down. The catering crews packed up their equipment, the front doors locked. The heavy footsteps of my father echoed down the main hall as he retired to the master suite. I sat in the dark for hours, measuring the passage of time by the ticking of the vintage watches lined up on my dresser. Patience was my trade. I knew how to wait for the exact right moment to strike. At 2 a.m, the house was submerged in total silence. I stood up and slipped out of my bedroom. I moved through the dark corridors with practiced stealth, avoiding the floorboards I knew would creak. I reached the first floor and approached the security panel outside my father's home office. The red light blinked in the gloom, a digital sentry guarding the epicenter of his fraudulent empire. I raised my hand and entered the code I had stolen from my mother, 4792. The keypad beeped softly and the indicator light turned green. I turned the brass knob and pushed the heavy door open. My father's office smelled of expensive leather and aged scotch. The curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the ambient glow of the street lamps outside. I moved behind his massive desk and touched the trackpad of his laptop. The screen woke up, demanding a password. I reached into the pocket of my jeans and pulled out a small encrypted flash drive Wyatt Davis had given me during our meeting in the library archives. The federal agent had promised the software on this drive would bypass the localized security and create a backdoor directly into the internal servers. I slid the metal drive into the side port of the computer. The screen flashed once a sharp burst of blue light illuminating my face in the pitch-black room. Lines of code began scrolling rapidly across the monitor, hunting for the digital ledgers that tied the stolen $3 million to the offshore shell companies. I stood in the eerie blue glow, watching my father's secrets bleed out into the federal network, waiting for the extraction to finish. The progress bar crawled across the encrypted monitor. 14%, 22%. The stark blue light washed over the expanse of the mahogany desk, casting long, warped shadows against the leather-bound books lining the walls. I kept my eyes fixed on the heavy office door, listening to the suffocating silence of the sleeping townhouse. The federal flash drive was doing its work, silently siphoning the digital ledgers that connected my father to a labyrinth of offshore shell companies. To pass the agonizing minutes, I brushed my fingertips over the laptop trackpad, waking the secondary screen. My father rarely closed his applications. An email client sat maximized in the corner. I should have ignored it. The objective was purely financial data. But a specific folder labeled with my sister's initials caught my attention. It was titled with the upcoming gala date and a budget marker. I clicked the folder. A chain of messages loaded on the screen, time-stamped 3 weeks prior. The recipients were Richard Sylvia and Victoria. I read the initial message. It was from my father detailing the severe liquidity shortage threatening his hedge fund. He warned my mother and sister that the impending merger required a flawless balance sheet for the Securities and Exchange Commission auditors. He stated in stark financial terms that the lavish engagement gala might need a reduced budget to cover his offshore margins. The reply came from Victoria, my flawless, glittering sister. I read her words twice, the glowing white text burning a permanent image into my memory. Her response was calculated and entirely devoid of empathy. She instructed our father not to touch the gala budget. She argued that her billionaire fiancé belonged to a family that scrutinized assets, and downgrading the reception would signal weakness to her future in-laws. She insisted they needed to project untouchable wealth. Then she offered the solution. She pointed out that my 18th birthday was approaching. She wrote that I spent my days hiding in my room, playing with old clocks, and shrinking away from high society. She explicitly typed the words, "She does not even care about status, so she will not mind." Victoria suggested they use my trust fund to plug the offshore hole, advising our parents to simply tell me the money was tied up in long-term investments. Sylvia had replied mere minutes later, agreeing with the strategy. My mother praised Victoria's sharp instincts, noting that I required very little to be content and that I never bothered to read the documents they placed in front of me. I stared at the glowing monitor. The quiet hum of the laptop processor filled the void in the room. For my entire life, I had harbored a small, stubborn ember of guilt regarding my sister. I had always assumed Victoria was simply a product of our parents and their toxic environment, an unwitting participant in their vanity. I thought her arrogance was a shield, a symptom of the pressure they placed on her to be perfect. That illusion shattered, falling away like a cracked watch crystal. Victoria did not just know about the theft of my grandmother's gift, she had orchestrated it. She had offered me up as a sacrificial lamb to secure her marriage into a billionaire dynasty. She viewed my lack of greed not as a virtue, but as a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. Any lingering hesitation I held about destroying this family vanished in that cold blue light. When a master horologist encounters a stripped gear in a vintage timepiece, they do not attempt to glue the ruined metal back together. The structural integrity is permanently compromised. The only viable solution is to discard the broken piece and rebuild the mechanism from scratch. My mother, my father, my sister, they were all in on it. They had formed a unified front, constructing their glittering empire on the foundation of my stolen future. I felt a profound mechanical calm settle deep into my bones. The progress bar hit 99%. Then the floorboards out in the hallway groaned. A heavy footstep echoed through the corridor. Another followed, moving deliberately toward the office. My pulse hammered a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. I watched the screen. 100%. Extraction complete. I pulled the metal flash drive from the port and shoved it deep into the pocket of my jeans. The brass handle of the office door began to turn. There was no time to reach the service corridor. I backed away from the desk, moving with silent urgency toward the French doors lining the far wall of the office. I turned the brass latch, slipping outside onto the adjoining terrace, just as the main door swung open. I pulled the glass doors shut behind me, leaving a fraction of an inch open so the latch would not produce a telltale click. I pressed my back against the brick facade of the townhouse. The New York winter air hit me like a physical blow. I was wearing only a thin cotton shirt, and the freezing wind bit into my skin, stealing my breath instantly. I clamped a hand over my mouth, forcing my respirations into slow, shallow intervals to prevent my breath from fogging the glass. Through the narrow gap in the heavy velvet curtains, I watched my father step into the office. He wore a silk robe holding an empty crystal tumbler. He walked over to his desk, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He nudged the computer mouse. The monitor flared to life, displaying his mundane inbox exactly as he had left it. The federal extraction software had left no trace of its intrusion. He stood there for an agonizing minute, staring at the screen. My muscles trembled uncontrollably from the biting cold. If he looked toward the terrace, if he noticed the slight draft coming through the unlatched doors, the federal trap would unravel in seconds. I held perfectly still, becoming a shadow against the freezing brick. Finally, he turned away. He poured another measure of scotch from his wet bar and exited the room, pulling the door shut behind him with a solid thud. I waited 5 more minutes in the freezing dark before slipping back inside. I retraced my steps through the silent corridors, returning to my third-floor studio. I locked my door, wrapped myself in a heavy wool blanket, and waited for the dawn. The sun rose over Manhattan, painting the city skyline in shades of pale gold and slate gray. The townhouse awoke with a renewed, frantic energy. Today was the eve of the engagement gala. The catering trucks idled in the street below, their diesel engines rumbling through the walls. A sharp rap on my door broke my concentration. Before I could answer, Victoria pushed her way inside. She held a garment bag draped over one arm and a cup of artisan espresso in the other. Her hair was already professionally styled, her face a canvas of flawless, camera-ready makeup. She tossed the plastic garment bag onto my bed. "Try it on," she ordered, taking a sip of her coffee. "The seamstress is downstairs if it needs taking in." I unzipped the cover. Inside hung a bridesmaid dress. It was a dull, shapeless garment made of cheap polyester chiffon in a muted, lifeless shade of beige. It was a dress designed to render the wearer invisible. It was a stark, intentional contrast to the custom silk couture she would be wearing tonight. She wanted me to look like a faded background extra in the glossy photographs of her triumph. "It is perfect," I said, keeping my voice mild and compliant. Victoria sighed, looking around my modest room with a mixture of pity and distinct disdain. "Just make sure your hair is pulled back tight, Fiona," she instructed. "The society photographers will be everywhere tonight. Preston's family is very particular about aesthetics and status. I need you to stand on the periphery, stay out of the main focal shots, and just smile. Can you do that? Can you manage to look happy for me?" I looked at my older sister. I thought about the email chain sitting on a federal flash drive in my pocket. I thought about the $3 million moving toward a trap she had helped design. She believed she had won. She believed she had successfully consumed my future to fuel her own ascent into the elite. I reached out and touched the scratchy fabric of the cheap beige dress. I looked back at Victoria, letting a soft, genuine smile touch the corners of my mouth. "Of course, Victoria," I said, my voice smooth and entirely untroubled. "I will smile for the cameras. It is going to be an unforgettable night." She nodded, satisfied with my apparent submission, and swept out of the room to continue directing her kingdom. I turned back to my workbench, my smile lingering in the quiet room. She had handed me a cheap dress, unaware that I was holding the matches to burn her empire to the ground. The burner phone, hidden deep within the lining of my winter coat, vibrated with a sharp, singular pulse. I stood in my quiet third-floor studio, the afternoon light casting long shadows across my tools. I retrieved the device, sliding my thumb over the dark screen. The text message from Wyatt Davis was brief, carrying the grim authority of a ticking clock. My father had just initiated the wire transfer to a holding company based in the Cayman Islands. The trap was armed. But a severe complication had surfaced within the banking protocol. The financial institution had flagged the transaction, a domestic trust account moving $3 million to a notorious offshore haven triggered an automatic security hold. The bank required verbal authorization from the primary account holder. They required my voice on a recorded line. Wyatt warned me in a follow-up message that Richard would be summoning me shortly. This was the most precarious phase of the entire federal operation. If I hesitated during the phone call, the bank compliance officer would freeze the transfer pending a formal fraud investigation. If I refused to speak, my father would instantly recognize my betrayal, prompting him to scrub his digital servers and abort the pending corporate merger. I had to sit in a room with the man stealing my future and cheerfully authorize my own robbery. A brisk knock rattled my studio door. One of the catering assistants poked her head inside, avoiding my gaze, and relayed the message that my father requested my presence in his study. I tucked the burner phone into my pocket, smoothed my expression into a mask of placid obedience, and walked toward the stairs. The lower levels of the townhouse were a frantic symphony of gala preparations. Florists debated the placement of white hydrangeas, while event planners directed the flow of rented silver trays. I navigated through the chaos like a ghost moving toward the heavy oak doors of the study. I turned the brass knob and stepped inside. The afternoon sun poured through the tall windows, painting the mahogany room in stark, unforgiving light. My father sat behind his vast desk. He wore a crisp white shirt, the cuffs rolled up to reveal his forearms, projecting the image of a man comfortably in command. When he saw me, the corners of his mouth lifted into a smile. It was a terrifying expression. Richard Adelaide rarely smiled at me unless he was extracting tangible value from my existence. Growing up, affection in our house was a strictly transactional currency. My father never offered praise without a corresponding demand. A rare compliment meant I was expected to quietly disappear during an important dinner party to avoid embarrassing my glittering sister. Today, the transaction sat neatly in the center of his pristine leather blotter. He motioned for me to take the leather chair opposite him. As I sat down, he slid a crisp white envelope across the desk. It stopped inches from my fingertips. I looked at him, feigning a look of mild confusion. He leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together, and adopted a tone of warm paternal generosity that made the hairs on my arms stand up. He told me the envelope was a token of his deep appreciation. He called it a small allowance for being such a wonderful team player during a highly stressful week for the family. He urged me to open it. I peeled back the paper flap. Inside sat 5 crisp $100 bills. $500 in exchange for $3 million. It was the ultimate insult, a precise metric of exactly how stupid he believed I was. I looked down at the cash, forcing a bright, naive smile onto my face. I thanked him, channeling the exact pitch of a grateful, sheltered teenager who had never seen real money. He nodded, entirely satisfied with his cheap purchase of my loyalty. But the pleasantries evaporated in the next breath. He leaned forward, his posture growing rigid, the predatory instinct returning to his eyes. He explained there was a minor administrative hurdle regarding the tax forms I had signed the previous morning. The bank needed a quick verbal confirmation to process the paperwork. He picked up the receiver of his desk phone, punched in a sequence of numbers, and pressed the speaker button. The dial tone echoed in the quiet room, followed by the sterile rings of a corporate banking line. A woman answered, her voice crisp and heavily modulated, announcing herself as a compliance officer for the International Wire Division. My father introduced himself, his tone smooth and professional, stating that his daughter was present to authorize the scheduled transfer. He muted the microphone for a fraction of a second, locking his eyes onto mine. The silent threat in his gaze was unmistakable. He was daring me to falter. He unmuted the line. The banker asked me to state my full legal name for the recording. I took a slow, measured breath, centering myself the same way I did before dropping a microscopic gear into a watch movement. I spoke clearly toward the speakerphone. I stated my name. The banker then asked for my date of birth, my social security number, and my mother's maiden name. I recited the data points flawlessly, keeping my voice light and unbothered. The final question arrived, the hinge upon which the entire federal case rested. The compliance officer read the transfer details, outlining the movement of $3 million from my domestic trust to a specified routing number in the Cayman Islands. She asked if I initiated this transfer of my own free will and if I understood that the transaction was irrevocable. My father did not blink. His hands gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white. The silence in the room stretched thick and suffocating. I smiled at him, offering a soft, reassuring expression. I leaned closer to the phone and gave a clear, cheerful affirmation. I told the banker I understood perfectly and authorized the transfer without reservation. The compliance officer confirmed the authorization and disconnected the call. The dial tone returned, signaling the end of the trap. My father exhaled a long, shuddering breath. The tension bled out of his shoulders, his rigid posture collapsing into sheer relief. The fatal hole in his offshore shell company was plugged. The European merger was saved. He had secured his empire, and he believed he had done it without leaving a single trace. He stood up, buttoning his cuffs, his mind already shifting to the next corporate conquest. He told me I was a good daughter. He told me to go buy myself a nice pair of shoes for the gala with the cash he gave me. He dismissed me with a dismissive wave of his hand, turning his attention to the glowing screen of his laptop. I picked up the white envelope, the $500, feeling weightless in my grip. I walked out of the study, maintaining my quiet, compliant facade until I cleared the hallway and reached the safety of the service stairs. I climbed the steps to my third-floor sanctuary, my heart beating a steady, victorious rhythm. I closed my bedroom door and locked the deadbolt. I reached into my pocket and retrieved the burner phone. The screen was dark, but the moment I pressed the side button, a new message illuminated the glass. It was a single word from Wyatt Davis. Traced. I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the letters. The bait had been swallowed whole. The offshore accounts were tagged. The federal net was now tightly drawn around my father's throat. The countdown to the engagement gala had officially begun. The Adelaide townhouse dissolved into an orchestrated frenzy as the evening approached, morphing from a private residence into a glittering staging ground. The engagement gala functioned primarily as a victory lap for my father's pending corporate merger, a spectacular display of manufactured wealth designed to blind his future European partners. Hundreds of imported white orchids cascaded from tall crystal vases stationed along the marble corridors, their heavy floral scent masking the underlying tension in the house. Rental companies delivered velvet seating arrangements, erecting a temporary ballroom on the first floor, where our formal living room used to be. The air hummed with the overlapping voices of frantic event planners, stressed florists, and catering crews navigating the chaotic floor plan. I moved through this opulent maze like a phantom. No one acknowledged my presence. I sidestepped a frantic man carrying a tower of silver platters, slipping quietly toward the perimeter of the main atrium to observe the machinery of my family in motion. My invisibility was a lifelong condition meticulously cultivated by parents who found my lack of social ambition deeply irritating. If I was not providing liquid capital or a favorable photo opportunity, I ceased to exist in their ecosystem. Tonight was no exception. Sylvia intercepted me near the grand staircase. She wore an emerald silk gown that pooled around her heels, directing the placement of a complex lighting rig with sharp, precise gestures. She noticed me lingering near the banister and sighed, clearly annoyed that I occupied physical space during her triumph. She told me to stand out of the way. She instructed me to remain hidden in the shadows once the high-profile guests arrived, emphasizing that the evening belonged exclusively to Victoria and her billionaire future in-laws. I offered a soft, compliant nod, retreating toward the dark mahogany alcove near the coat check. It was safer to watch a collapsing structure from a distance. From the shadows, I observed the architect of my stolen future. Richard Adelaide stood in the center of the drawing room, holding a heavy crystal tumbler of expensive amber scotch. He was surrounded by 3 senior partners from his hedge fund, their loud, echoing laughter bouncing off the paneled walls. My father possessed a charismatic arrogance that mesmerized other Wall Street predators. He clinked his glass against theirs, loudly bragging about the unshakable liquidity of his firm. He boasted that their upcoming merger would dominate the global market by Monday morning. Watching him felt deeply surreal. His posture radiated total security, a confidence built entirely upon the stolen funds currently sitting in a monitored offshore trap. He genuinely believed his intellect had outmaneuvered the market, blind to the reality that his quiet, obedient 18-year-old daughter had engineered his looming destruction. His hubris was dense, a thick armor forged from decades of escaping consequences, and it was about to shatter. A few feet away, Victoria emerged from the master suite, descending the sweeping staircase like a reigning monarch. She wore a custom silk gown that caught the ambient light radiating the flawless perfection our family demanded. Sylvia immediately abandoned the lighting crew to hover over her favorite child. I watched from the alcove as my mother adjusted a heavy diamond necklace resting against Victoria's collarbone. Their voices were low, but the pristine acoustics of the marble foyer carried the sound directly to my ears. Sylvia whispered about the immense power they were about to consolidate. She told Victoria that this strategic marriage would render the Adelaide women untouchable in New York society. They were celebrating a dynasty funded by my erased inheritance, entirely unbothered by the quiet sister they had sacrificed to build it. They smiled together, presenting a picture of polished vanity, unaware that their entire foundation rested on a wire transfer currently being tracked by federal authorities. I turned away from the spectacle and climbed the back service stairs to my third-floor studio. The heavy oak door shut out the noise of the impending gala, returning me to the familiar scent of clock oil and brass. I stood in the center of my quiet workspace and pulled a single faded canvas duffel bag from the bottom of my closet. While my family chased limitless excess, I valued precision and economy. I packed only what held genuine worth. I placed my titanium tweezers, my specialized jeweler's loop, and a set of precision screwdrivers into a protective leather roll. I added a few changes of plain clothes and a battered notebook containing my grandmother's original watchmaking schematics. The bag felt remarkably light, a sharp contrast to the suffocating weight of the townhouse surrounding me. I zipped the canvas closed, feeling a profound sense of closure. I carried the bag down the narrow back hallway, stashing it carefully behind a large decorative urn next to the service elevator. My exit strategy was in position, waiting for the final act to conclude. The first wave of elite guests began flooding through the main entrance, bringing a rush of freezing winter air and the sharp scent of expensive perfume. I slipped a plain black uniform apron over my cheap beige bridesmaid dress, blending seamlessly into the army of hired help circulating through the rooms. I grabbed an empty silver tray from a nearby staging table and navigated toward the kitchen to maintain my cover. As I pushed through the heavy swinging doors, a tall man in a crisp white catering shirt and a black uniform vest intercepted me. He held a large tray loaded with crystal champagne flutes. He turned his face toward the harsh fluorescent kitchen lighting, revealing sharp, familiar features. It was Wyatt Davis. The federal agent had shed his notary disguise, seamlessly adopting the frantic, hurried energy of a banquet manager. He stepped directly into my path, smoothly exchanging his loaded tray for my empty one. His movements were fluid, practiced, and drew no attention from the frantic chefs plating hors d'oeuvres a few feet away. He leaned in close, his voice barely a breath above the clatter of the busy commercial kitchen. He told me the warrants had just been signed by a federal judge. The electronic signatures were secure and legally binding. The holding accounts in the Cayman Islands were officially frozen by international authorities, trapping the stolen money exactly where it needed to be. The operation was a success. He instructed me to return to the ballroom and wait for the climax of my father's upcoming speech. That specific moment was the designated signal. The raid would begin the second Richard reached the height of his arrogant performance. Wyatt stepped back, adjusting his black vest, and disappeared into the chaotic current of catering staff. I stood holding the heavy silver tray, the crystal glasses chiming softly against each other in a delicate musical rhythm. The countdown had reached its final minutes. I pushed back through the kitchen doors and walked out into the glittering heart of the Adelaide Empire, carrying the champagne they would never get to drink. I carried the heavy silver tray through the glittering crowd, offering crystal flutes of imported champagne to billionaires and socialites who looked right through me. The temporary ballroom hummed with the sound of a live string quartet and the low, confident murmur of high finance. Victoria held court near a towering ice sculpture, her laugh echoing like shattering glass as she leaned into her fiancé with practiced photogenic devotion. My mother glided between groups of international investors, ensuring every glass remained full and every conversation stayed centered on the unmatched brilliance of the Adelaide family. I kept my head down, my cheap beige dress hidden beneath the plain black caterer apron, blending seamlessly into the background noise of their manufactured triumph. Through the sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns, a sharp figure cut a direct, urgent path toward my father. It was Marcus Pierce. Marcus served as lead counsel for the hedge fund. He was not a man who drafted standard contracts or negotiated minor settlements. He was a corporate fixer, a legal architect hired specifically to find loopholes in international tax codes and bury severe liabilities long before they ever reached a courtroom. He earned his exorbitant monthly retainer by anticipating catastrophic disasters long before the first crack appeared in the financial foundation. Tonight, he moved with a rigid, hurried posture that betrayed his usual icy composure. He bypassed the customary social pleasantries, grabbing my father by the elbow and steering him forcefully away from a group of wealthy European partners. I adjusted my grip on the silver tray, drifting closer to the edge of the mahogany pillars near the drawing room. I needed to hear the friction grinding in their gears. Marcus leaned in close to my father, his voice a tight, hushed hiss that barely carried over the music. The lawyer explained he had just reviewed the confirmation receipts for the offshore wire. The $3 million transfer had processed, but the routing sequence contained a fatal, undeniable anomaly. The digital footprint had pinged a federal compliance server before landing in the Cayman holding account. Marcus stated clearly that an ordinary banking delay might trigger a routine flag, but a federal ping meant active, targeted surveillance. He advised my father to halt the upcoming merger announcement immediately. He demanded they move the funds back to a domestic shell and delay the European partners for at least 48 hours until his team could run a full security sweep on their internal networks. The blood drained from my father's face. The supreme confidence he had projected all evening dissolved into stark, naked fear. The two senior executives standing nearby caught the sudden shift in tone. They abandoned their drinks, pulling into a tight circle with Marcus and my father. Panic rippled through their ranks, a silent contagion infecting the core architects of the hedge fund. They were men accustomed to operating in the shadows of the market, and the sudden threat of federal light terrified them. The impending merger was their crowning achievement, the deal that would secure their legacy. Halting it tonight would signal catastrophic weakness to the market, but proceeding under federal scrutiny could mean decades in a penitentiary. My father looked around the room, his eyes darting frantically across the crowd, searching for the source of a leak. His gaze snagged on me. I was standing near a marble pillar, holding the half-empty tray of champagne, trying to look as unremarkable as possible. The transformation in his demeanor was instantaneous. The polished, charismatic billionaire vanished entirely, replaced by a desperate, cornered predator fighting for survival. He broke away from the huddle, striding across the ballroom floor with terrifying speed. He did not care who saw him abandon his guests. He closed the distance between us, grabbing my upper arm with a bruising, painful grip. His fingers dug into my muscle, pulling me roughly away from the catering path and dragging me toward the secluded coat check room near the service entrance. He shoved me through the narrow doorway, closing the heavy paneled door behind us to muffle the sound of the string quartet. The small room smelled of damp wool, expensive winter coats, and stale perfume. My father backed me against a row of heavy cashmere overcoats, his face inches from mine. The scent of scotch on his breath was overpowering. The facade of paternal warmth he had used in his study earlier today was entirely gone, stripped away by the imminent threat of losing his empire. He demanded answers. His voice was a harsh, ragged whisper designed to intimidate. He wanted to know exactly what happened when I spoke to the bank compliance officer. He asked if anyone else had accessed the trust documents or questioned the paperwork. He leaned closer, his eyes wild and accusing, demanding to know if I had contacted my grandmother's estate lawyer behind his back. He suspected the weak link in his perfect crime was the daughter he had spent 18 years treating as a useless afterthought. This was the ultimate fracture point. If I showed a single spark of intelligence, if my posture reflected the hardened steel I had built inside my watchmaker studio, he would know the truth. He would cancel the speech, scrub the servers, and the impending FBI raid would hit a hollowed-out shell. I had to defuse the bomb using the only tool my family had ever handed me. I had to weaponize my own trauma. I let the silver tray slip from my hands. It clattered loudly onto the hardwood floor, sending crystal flutes tumbling and shattering into the shadows. I shrank back against the racks of coats, pulling my shoulders inward to make my physical form as small as possible. I summoned every painful memory of my mother's harsh audits, every time my sister had belittled my interests, every formal dinner where I was told my voice did not matter. I allowed the conditioned panic to flood my system. My breathing grew ragged and shallow. I widened my eyes, letting hot tears pool and spill down my cheeks. I began to tremble, a genuine physical reaction to the sheer proximity of his rage, but I channeled that fear into a performance of profound, helpless confusion. I stammered uncontrollably. I told him I did not understand what he was talking about. I cried, my voice pitching up into the terrified, desperate tone of a sheltered teenager who had just broken a rule she did not comprehend. I babbled about the $500 allowance he had given me, swearing I had just put the cash in my bedroom drawer and had not spoken to a single soul. I begged him to tell me what I did wrong, apologizing profusely for dropping the glasses on the floor. I let my knees buckle slightly, sliding an inch down the wall, projecting a total emotional collapse. My father stared at me. He looked at my tear-streaked face, my trembling hands, and the shattered crystal at my feet. He searched my eyes for any sign of deception, any hint of calculated betrayal. But he found nothing, because he was blinded by his own lifelong assumptions. He had spent 18 years convincing himself that I was a dull, compliant disappointment, a simple girl who preferred fixing old clocks to understanding high finance. He could not fathom a reality where the daughter he deemed invisible had engineered a federal sting operation. The tension in his jaw relaxed, replaced by a profound, unmistakable disgust. He let go of my arm, stepping back, as if touching me was a waste of his valuable energy. He straightened his tailored jacket, his breathing returning to a measured, arrogant rhythm. He looked down at me, a pathetic, weeping mess, huddled against a row of coats, and his hubris won the internal battle. He decided Marcus Pierce was being overly paranoid. He convinced himself the routing anomaly was just a standard digital glitch, a meaningless delay in the international banking system. He believed his own myth of invincibility. He sneered, telling me to clean up the broken glass and stay out of sight for the rest of the evening. He turned on his heel, pulling the heavy door open and stepping back out into the glittering light of his impending triumph. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing me back inside the quiet, dim space. The transformation took less than 3 seconds. The ragged breathing ceased. The trembling in my shoulders stopped. I stood up straight, brushing a speck of lint from the cheap beige fabric of my dress. I reached up with the back of my hand and wiped the tears from my cheeks in one swift, efficient motion. The terrified, confused teenager vanished, leaving only the cold, calculated precision of a watchmaker. I looked down at the shattered crystal on the floor. My father had chosen his ego over caution. He was walking toward the podium to deliver a speech built on stolen money and fragile lies. The federal trap was set, the bait had held, and the countdown had reached 0. I smoothed my hair, turned the brass knob, and stepped out to watch the empire fall. I left the stifling confines of the coat room and navigated the narrow service corridor, my cheap beige dress brushing against the dark flocked wallpaper. The thumping bass of a cello and the bright, sharp notes of a violin guided my steps back toward the center of the Adelaide Empire. I pushed through a discreet side exit, stepping past a line of hired security guards, and merged into the periphery of the temporary ballroom. The space was a breathtaking feat of engineering and vanity. My mother had hired contractors to remove the interior partition walls of the penthouse, transforming the main living area into a cavernous glass-walled arena suspended hundreds of feet above the city streets. The panoramic windows showcased the glittering Manhattan skyline, a sprawling grid of gold and silver lights that seemed to bow to the wealth gathered inside this room. Waiters glided past me in synchronized formations carrying silver trays of caviar truffle tartlets and vintage champagne. The air tasted of expensive perfume and corporate ambition. I positioned myself at the very back of the room, standing beside the heavy oak double doors that served as the primary entrance. From this vantage point, holding a discarded cloth napkin to blend in with the catering staff, I possessed a clear, unobstructed view of the elevated stage set up against the glass backdrop. A gentle chime echoed through the sophisticated sound system, bringing the low hum of hundreds of conversations to a gradual halt. The string quartet faded into silence. The crowd turned their collective attention toward the front of the room, a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns, parting slightly to offer a clear line of sight. My father stepped up to the clear acrylic podium. The transformation was flawless. The desperate, panicked man who had just grabbed my arm in the shadows, frantic over a banking anomaly, was gone. In his place stood Richard Adelaide, the titan of Wall Street. He adjusted the microphone with a practiced, effortless grace. The sprawling city skyline behind him served as a fitting halo for a man who believed he owned the world. Growing up, I watched my father deliver countless variations of this exact performance. He treated every public interaction as an opportunity to secure a dominant position, weaving charm and authority into a hypnotic blend that blinded his competitors and charmed his regulators. He knew precisely when to pause, when to lower his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, and when to project unwavering strength. He smiled at the crowd. He welcomed the elite figures of finance, the European delegates, and the local politicians whose campaigns he covertly funded. He spoke of the future. He described his hedge fund not merely as a business, but as an evolving organism designed to conquer new frontiers. He painted a picture of infinite growth, assuring the foreign investors in the front row that the impending merger would usher in a golden era of global market dominance. But true power, my father declared, his voice rich and resonant, carrying to the furthest corners of the room, is never built in isolation. It is cultivated through loyalty. It requires a bedrock of unwavering support from those who share your vision. He gestured toward the front table, his face softening into an expression of curated devotion. I invite my extraordinary wife Sylvia and my brilliant daughter Victoria to join me up here on stage." The audience erupted into polite, measured applause. Sylvia rose from her seat with the fluid elegance of a seasoned socialite. Her emerald silk gown shimmered under the theatrical lighting, her posture rigid and perfect. She climbed the short staircase to the stage, taking her place at my father's right side. Victoria followed, her custom couture dress catching every flash from the hired photographers positioned near the speakers. She linked her arm through our mother's, projecting the flawless, pristine image of a powerful dynasty. They stood together, a trinity of wealth and status, posing for the cameras with dazzling uniform smiles. Sylvia whispered something out of the corner of her mouth, and Victoria let out a musical, performative laugh that charmed the executives in the front row. He did not call my name. He did not look toward the back of the room to find the child who had funded this entire charade. In the grand narrative of the Adelaide legacy, I remained a discarded draft, an inconvenient footnote erased from the final manuscript. I stood by the oak doors, my hands folded neatly in front of my waist. I did not feel a trace of sorrow or rejection. I felt only the quiet, icy precision of a watchmaker verifying the final alignment of a complex mechanism. They looked so proud, so secure in their stolen victory, unaware that the gears grinding beneath their feet were about to tear their stage apart. My father raised his crystal flute. The crowd mirrored the gesture, a synchronized wave of sparkling wine lifting into the air. The lighting shifted, dimming the overhead chandeliers and casting a warm, concentrated spotlight directly onto the three figures on stage. The Manhattan skyline sparkled behind them, a vast ocean of electricity framing their triumph. "We stand on the precipice of a historic union," my father continued, his tone carrying the weight of a monumental declaration. "To our new partners crossing the Atlantic, I make you this promise today. The Adelaide firm does not deal in half measures. We do not tolerate failure, and we do not hide from scrutiny." The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air. He was a man standing over a trap door boasting about the solid ground beneath his shoes. He had forged my signature, stolen my inheritance, and routed the funds through a labyrinth of illegal offshore accounts just hours ago. He had physically threatened me in a courtroom to protect his lies. Yet he stood before the most powerful people in New York and draped himself in a cloak of righteous integrity. "A legacy that withstands the test of time requires more than just capital," he proclaimed, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "It requires character. It requires a commitment to doing what is difficult, even when no one is watching. Our impending merger, our continued success, and the very foundation of this family are built upon two unyielding pillars." He paused, letting the silence stretch, mastering the theatrical tension of the room. He looked out over the audience, his chest puffed out, radiating a blinding, toxic hubris. He believed he had won. He believed the stolen money was secure, the federal auditors were pacified, and his quiet daughter had retreated into the shadows forever. "We are built on unshakable foundations and pure, uncompromised transparency." He held his glass high, ready to deliver the final toast. The audience inhaled, preparing to drink to his glorious deception. My mother beamed her eyes, fixed on the lenses of the photographers. Victoria leaned her head onto my father's shoulder, securing the perfect angle for the front page of tomorrow's society columns. I stood motionless in the dim light at the back of the room. I kept my eyes fixed on the man who had traded my freedom for his survival. I waited for the pendulum to swing. Before a single drop of champagne could touch my father's lips, a sound fractured the perfect stillness of the ballroom. It was not a scream, it was not an alarm, it was a definitive, echoing crack. The heavy oak double doors, situated mere inches from my left shoulder, burst open, slamming against the marble walls with a deafening, concussive force. The heavy brass hardware rattled from the impact. The sound tore through the sophisticated acoustics of the room, sharp and unforgiving, cutting my father's grand speech dead in the freezing air. The echoing sound of the heavy oak doors hitting the marble walls rippled across the temporary ballroom. The noise hung in the air, a harsh physical intrusion into a carefully curated space. The cellist jerked his bow across the strings, producing a sharp, discordant screech before the entire string quartet fell into a stunned silence. The low hum of elite conversation evaporated. A suffocating stillness descended over the gathering of foreign investors, corporate executives, and Upper East Side socialites. Hundreds of heads turned in unison toward the back of the room. Wyatt Davis walked through the entryway. He no longer wore the ill-fitting gray suit of a hired notary, nor the crisp white shirt of a banquet manager. He wore a dark navy windbreaker. Bright yellow letters spanning his back and chest spelled out the acronym of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He did not enter the room with a rushed, frantic pace. He walked with a steady, measured stride, carrying the quiet, undeniable authority of a man who held the winning hand. A dozen federal agents flanked him. They wore identical tactical jackets, their expressions uniformly stern and focused. They did not shout orders. They did not draw weapons. They simply fanned out along the perimeter of the ballroom, taking up positions by the service exits, the coat check, and the glass walls. Their synchronized movement turned the glittering event space into a locked containment zone. The elite crowd, men and women who commanded multinational corporations and dictated market trends, instinctively stepped back. The sea of tailored tuxedos and designer silk gowns parted, creating a wide, unobstructed path down the center aisle. Wealth provides a powerful shield against many inconveniences, but it offers zero protection against a federal raid playing out in front of a live audience. The billionaires and hedge fund managers pressed themselves against the linen-covered tables, eager to distance themselves from the blast radius of the Adelaide family. From my position near the doorway, I watched Wyatt move down the aisle. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead, ignoring the gasps and murmured whispers of the terrified guests. On the elevated stage, the trinity of Adelaide perfection fractured. My father stood frozen behind the clear acrylic podium, the crystal flute in his hand tilted, spilling expensive champagne over the rim and onto his polished leather shoes. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. For a man who had spent 3 decades anticipating market fluctuations and exploiting legal loopholes, the sight of federal agents marching down his own ballroom floor was a variable he had never calculated. He had spent his entire career believing his intellect placed him beyond the reach of consequence. That belief was currently evaporating under the bright theatrical lights. Beside him, my mother experienced her own physical collapse. Sylvia Adelaide curated her reality with ruthless control, ensuring every detail projected invulnerability. As Wyatt approached the stage, her fingers went limp. Her crystal glass slipped from her grasp. It struck the marble floor of the stage, shattering into countless sharp fragments. The delicate chime of the breaking crystal echoed through the silent room, a fitting soundtrack for the ruin of her social empire. She stared at the federal agents, her pristine posture crumbling. Victoria shrank backward, clutching the fabric of her custom gown. Her performative smile vanished, replaced by stark, uncomprehending terror. She looked out into the crowd, her eyes frantically searching for her billionaire fiancé, only to find him already edging toward the far exit, surrounded by his own panicked legal team. Wyatt reached the base of the stage. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sophisticated acoustics of the room, designed to amplify my father's arrogant toast, now served to broadcast his ruin. Wyatt climbed the short staircase, his boots making heavy, definitive sounds against the wood. He stopped 3 feet away from my father. The agent reached into the inside pocket of his windbreaker and retrieved a folded document. He opened the paper, smoothing the creases, with a deliberate, unhurried motion. He addressed my father by his full legal name, his baritone voice carrying a chilling professional detachment. He announced that he held a federal warrant authorized by a United States District Court judge. He read the charges aloud, his words slicing through the stagnant air of the ballroom. Wire fraud, insider trading, grand larceny. Each charge landed like a physical blow against the Adelaide legacy. Wyatt detailed the systemic embezzlement of corporate pension funds, the orchestration of fraudulent shell companies, and the deliberate manipulation of international markets. He laid out a 3-year catalog of predatory crimes in front of the very partners and investors my father had invited to celebrate his triumph. The primal instinct for survival flared inside my father. He let go of his spilled champagne glass, gripping the edges of the podium. He attempted to reconstruct his shattered facade, trying to project the intimidating authority that had always shielded him. He interrupted Wyatt, his voice trembling but loud. He declared the intrusion an outrageous mistake. He called it a clerical error, a gross misinterpretation of standard corporate practices. He demanded that the agents leave his home immediately. He pointed a shaking finger at Wyatt, threatening to call Marcus Pierce and the most ruthless defense attorneys in New York. He yelled that he would see the entire federal agency sued for defamation, trying to convince the silent crowd that he was the victim of a bureaucratic witch hunt. He lied with the desperate, frantic energy of a man watching his life burn to the ground. Wyatt allowed the outburst to run its course. He stood perfectly still, letting my father exhaust his remaining reserves of fake bravado. When the shouting finally guttered out into ragged, heavy breathing, Wyatt folded the warrant. The federal agent leaned closer to the microphone on the podium. His next words were precise, stripping away the final layer of my father's defense. Wyatt explained the mechanics of the trap. He told my father that the international banking anomaly Marcus Pierce had warned him about in the coat room was not a glitch. He detailed the specific routing numbers of the $3 million wire transfer executed earlier that afternoon. The funds did not reach the Cayman Islands holding company. The offshore shell my father relied upon to hide his stolen assets had been intercepted. Wyatt revealed that the federal government had mirrored the routing sequence. When my father forced me to authorize the transfer on a recorded line, the money bypassed the international network entirely. It flowed straight into a highly secure, federally controlled escrow account. Wyatt looked my father in the eye, delivering the final, inescapable truth. The authorized transfer provided the exact, irrefutable paper trail the Bureau needed. The federal agents had tracked the digital footprint directly from the Adelaide Domestic Trust into the heart of the fraudulent network. The trap had closed. Every corporate bank account, every offshore shell, and every asset tied to the hedge fund was officially frozen by court order. The empire was gone. The checkmate was complete. Two federal agents stepped forward from the shadows flanking the stage. They moved with a practiced, terrifying efficiency, closing the distance to the clear acrylic podium before my father could string another lie together. One agent grasped his right wrist, twisting his arm behind his back with a firm, unyielding motion. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed through the ballroom. It was a small sound, yet it carried enough kinetic force to sever the Adelaide dynasty from its throne. Richard fought the restraint, his tailored navy jacket bunched awkwardly around his shoulders, ruining the bespoke silhouette he had carefully cultivated for the cameras. The pristine image of a Wall Street titan evaporated into the humid air, leaving behind a desperate, cornered man fighting against undeniable reality. He twisted his neck, his eyes scanning the crowd of elite investors, foreign delegates, and politicians who were already taking strategic steps backward. He needed a scapegoat. He needed someone weaker to absorb the catastrophic impact of his ruin. He refused to accept that a man of his stature could fall by his own hand. His frantic, searching gaze stopped when his eyes locked onto me. I remained standing by the heavy oak doors at the back of the room, my hands folded calmly over the black caterer apron covering my cheap beige dress. I did not break eye contact. "It was her!" my father screamed, his voice cracked under the immense strain of his panic sounding thin and reedy. He thrust his restrained hands in my direction, ignoring the federal agents tightening the cuffs around his wrists. "I did not authorize that offshore transfer. Fiona did. She signed the relinquishment forms in my library in front of a witness. She spoke to the bank compliance officer on a recorded line today. She initiated the wire. Arrest her. She is the primary account holder." He was throwing his 18-year-old daughter into a federal fire to buy himself another breath of air. For decades, he had treated me as an invisible reserve of capital, a silent asset to be drained when necessary. Now, he intended to use me as a human shield. He genuinely believed his wealth and sheer volume could bend the narrative, convincing the Bureau that a quiet, unassuming teenager had orchestrated a sophisticated international embezzlement scheme while he played the innocent bystander. The polite murmurs in the ballroom flared into shocked, breathless gasps. Hundreds of eyes turned away from the stage, swiveling toward the back of the room to search for the girl standing in the shadows. The socialites and billionaires stared at me, trying to reconcile the image of a faded background extra with the accusations echoing off the glass walls. Wyatt Davis did not look at me. The federal agent turned his back on my father and faced the sea of terrified elites. He adjusted the lapels of his Navy windbreaker, his posture projecting an unyielding, grounded authority that made my father look like a petulant child. The young woman standing by the doors did not orchestrate this fraud, Wyatt announced. His baritone voice carried over the rising chaos, smooth and resolute. Ms. Adelaide has been a cooperating federal informant for the past 5 days. She acted under the direct, continuous supervision of the Bureau to secure the evidence required for these indictments. The shockwave hit the room with tangible physical force. The revelation struck the remaining pillars of the family facade, shattering them into dust. The narrative my parents had spun for years disintegrated in front of their most valuable peers. On the stage, Victoria crumpled. Her entire identity, her curated existence relied upon the wealth and status my father provided. The foundation holding up her elite pedestal vanished. She turned toward the front row, seeking refuge with her billionaire fiancé. She reached her hand out, her custom silk gown shimmering under the harsh stage lights, expecting him to rush forward and shield her from the disaster. He did not reach back. The heir to a global fortune possessed a primal instinct for self-preservation. He looked at Victoria, his face transforming into a mask of cold, sterile calculation. He evaluated the handcuffs, the federal agents, and the irreversible taint of a public scandal that would threaten his own family brand. He took a deliberate step backward. He raised his hand, signaling his private security detail. 4 men in dark suits immediately surrounded him, forming a protective barrier, and escorted him swiftly toward the nearest side exit. He did not say a single word to the woman he had promised to marry. He abandoned her on the stage, severing their engagement with a silent, ruthless retreat. Victoria dropped to her knees, her performative grace dissolved into raw, guttural sobbing. She wept loudly, tears ruining her flawless makeup. She did not cry for our father, who was currently being dragged down the stage stairs by federal agents. She cried for the loss of her glittering future. The exclusive kingdom she felt entitled to rule had just locked its iron gates against her forever. While Victoria collapsed, my mother mobilized. Sylvia Adelaide possessed an entirely different survival instinct. She was a woman who conquered New York society by refusing to accept defeat, operating on the belief that any situation could be managed if she applied enough pressure. The emerald silk of her gown rustled sharply as she descended the stage stairs, ignoring her handcuffed husband as he was read his rights. She marched down the center aisle, her heels striking the marble floor like a judge bringing down a gavel. The crowd of executives and socialites parted instantly, fearful of engaging with the disgraced matriarch. Her face was a portrait of unhinged fury. The sophisticated mask of the perfect hostess was gone, stripped away by the horrifying realization that her most discarded, underestimated asset had engineered her destruction. She crossed the length of the ballroom, her eyes fixed on me with a lethal, burning intensity. I did not step back. I did not lower my chin. I stood my ground, feeling the solid, cool brass of the door handle pressing against my spine. I took a slow, steady breath, regulating my heart rate to a calm, ticking rhythm. Sylvia stopped 2 feet away from me. Her breathing was ragged, her chest heaving under the expensive silk. She looked at the black apron tied over my dress, her expression twisting in profound, unfiltered disgust. She could not comprehend that a girl in cheap clothes had outmaneuvered a room full of titans. "Fix this!" she hissed. Her voice was shrill, vibrating with a frantic, desperate command. "Tell them it is a lie. Tell them you misunderstood the paperwork and made a mistake. You will call your grandfather's lawyers right now and retract every statement you made to these people." She pointed a trembling finger at my chest. She was attempting to command reality to change through sheer willpower. She still viewed me as the obedient, silent spare who could be bullied into submission through intimidation and threats of exile. She truly believed the federal government would halt an investigation if she simply ordered me to change my mind. "You have destroyed the Adelaide name," Sylvia yelled. Her voice escalated until it echoed off the panoramic glass walls, harsh and grating. "We gave you a home. We protected you from the real world. This is how you repay our loyalty? You turn on your own blood. You humiliate your sister in front of this entire city." She stepped closer, invading my personal space, trying to force me to flinch. She expected the familiar conditioned reaction. She anticipated my shoulders rounding inward, my eyes dropping to the marble floor, my voice trembling with desperate apologies. She waited for me to beg for her forgiveness. I gave her nothing. I maintained a neutral, steady gaze. The chaotic energy radiating from her washed over me without leaving a single mark. I watched her unravel with the detached precision of a horologist observing a broken, unsalvageable mechanism. She had spent 18 years teaching me how to disappear. She had conditioned me to observe the world from the shadows, to memorize the flaws, the secrets, and the vulnerabilities of the people who ignored my existence. She had handed me the very tools required to dismantle her life piece by piece. The ballroom remained frozen in silence. The foreign investors held their breath. The federal agents secured the perimeter, allowing the confrontation to unfold without interference. I looked at my mother. I looked at the frantic, terrified woman who had swept my stolen inheritance under the rug just as easily as she swept away a broken porcelain teacup in her kitchen. I felt the steady, measured rhythm of my own pulse, steady and unbroken. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I spoke in a quiet, even tone, ensuring every word carried the weight of a final, irreversible verdict. You told me I was invisible, Mom. You just forgot that invisible people can see everything you do. My words hung in the chilling air separating my mother and me. Sylvia Adelaide blinked. For the first time in my 18 years of life, the formidable matriarch of the Upper East Side had nothing to say. Her mouth opened, searching for a sharp reprimand, but the reality of the room crushed her defiance. She was no longer the apex predator of Manhattan society. She was just a woman standing in a ruined ballroom, stripped of her armor, exposed to the harsh glare of federal scrutiny. Around us, the tactical teams initiated the next phase of their operation. The swift dismantling of the hedge fund began not in a corporate boardroom, but right here among the imported floral arrangements and ice sculptures. Agents moved systematically through the crowd of elite guests. They approached the 3 senior executives who had been laughing with my father near the drawing room only an hour prior. The federal officers demanded their mobile devices and company laptops. One executive tried to argue, invoking his legal rights, but an agent merely presented a supplementary warrant. The crisp zip of heavy plastic evidence bags echoed over the silent crowd as expensive phones and encrypted tablets were confiscated. The structural pillars of my father's empire were being dismantled piece by piece. I turned my gaze back toward the stage. 2 agents escorted Richard Adelaide down the short staircase. His wrists remained bound behind his back. He stumbled slightly on the bottom step, his polished leather shoes slipping on a discarded linen napkin. No one reached out to steady him. The titans of industry who had eagerly raised their glasses to him just moments ago now averted their eyes. They stepped back, pressing their bodies against the glass walls, eager to avoid any association with a fallen king. My father walked the length of his own temporary ballroom in total disgrace. His bespoke charcoal suit was wrinkled, his platinum watch glinted under the lights, a useless accessory for a man whose time had run out. His reputation, his freedom, and his legacy were annihilated in front of the peers he so desperately wanted to impress. He did not look at me as he passed the heavy oak doors. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, shrinking into a reality he could no longer manipulate. The destruction of his business followed immediately. The CEO of the European conglomerate stood near the front row, his face flushed with indignation. He was a man who valued pristine public relations above all else. He pulled a sleek phone from his tuxedo pocket and began issuing loud, frantic instructions to his crisis management team. He ordered his lead counsel to sever all ties with the Adelaide firm, effective immediately. He demanded public statements distancing their conglomerate from the impending scandal, canceling the historic merger before the ink on the preliminary contracts could even dry. The billions of dollars my father had promised to secure vanished into the ether, leaving behind nothing but a profound, unpayable debt. On the elevated stage, Victoria remained entirely alone. The glittering engagement gala she had planned for months had transformed into an active crime scene. The catering staff abandoned their stations. The string quartet packed their instruments and slipped out the service exits. Victoria stood frozen in her custom silk couture gown, surrounded by scattered champagne flutes and the harsh glare of tactical flashlights. The society photographers, sensing a story far more lucrative than a simple high society wedding, raised their cameras. The blinding flashes illuminated her tear-streaked face. The expensive diamond necklace resting against her collarbone caught the erratic light, a mocking reminder of the wealth she had tried to secure through my destruction. She looked out into the crowd of retreating guests, her mouth opening in a silent plea for someone to rescue her. No one stepped forward. The people she considered peers were already busy deleting her contact information from their phones. She hugged her arms across her chest, trying to shield herself from the relentless exposure. The golden child, who had thrived on being the center of attention her entire life, finally realized the crushing weight of public scrutiny. Her billionaire fiancé was gone. Her elite status was gone. She was nothing more than the collateral damage of a greed she had willingly encouraged. My mother slowly backed away from me. Her legs seemed to lose their structural integrity. She stumbled toward a velvet-rented chair near the coat check and sank into the cushions. Sylvia stared blankly at the shattered crystal on the marble floor. Her pristine, manicured hands trembled as she gripped the armrests. Her entire identity rested on her ability to curate perfection and project power. She realized in that instant that her social currency was permanently revoked. The invitations to charity galas would cease. The exclusive country club memberships would be quietly canceled. The intricate social web she had woven over 30 years of ruthless climbing was unraveling in real time. She would no longer be feared or respected. She would become a cautionary tale whispered about over expensive lunches. She looked old, fragile, and utterly ordinary. She was exiled from the only world she cared about, trapped in a nightmare she could not redecorate. I stood by the doorway and observed the ruins of the Adelaide dynasty. I searched my own chest for any lingering trace of guilt. I waited for the conditioned remorse that usually followed any act of defiance in this household. I felt nothing of the sort. There was no sorrow, there was no regret. I experienced only the profound, settling quiet of a structure finally bearing the correct weight. For my entire life, my family had built their glittering tower on a crooked foundation, forcing me to bear the immense stress of their lies and their frantic ambition. The beams had finally snapped. The walls had fallen. The dust was settling over the debris, leaving behind a clean, empty expanse. The physics of the situation were flawless. A shadow fell over the floor in front of me. I looked up. Special Agent Wyatt Davis walked over from the center aisle. The intense, commanding authority he had projected toward my father softened as he approached the back of the room. He carried a sleek black leather folder tucked under his arm. He stopped a respectful distance away, ensuring he did not crowd my personal space. The chaotic noise of the raid continued around us, but a pocket of quiet calm seemed to surround the federal agent. He opened the leather folder and extracted a single, crisp sheet of paper. He extended his hand, offering the document to me. I took the paper, holding it up to the ambient light. It was an official banking confirmation bearing the seal of the Federal Reserve and the signature of a district judge. The text detailed the successful routing of $3 million. The funds had been fully recovered from the monitored escrow account and deposited directly into a newly established trust. The new account carried my name and my name alone. The document explicitly stated that Richard Adelaide held no legal authority, no power of attorney, and no access rights to the capital. The money my grandmother had left to me was secured, unburdened by my father's toxic legacy. My exit strategy was restored. I traced my name on the page, the ink feeling solid and real under my fingertips. The wealth did not represent luxury or elite status to me. It represented freedom. It represented the quiet, sunlit horology shop I would open in Brooklyn, far away from the manipulative cruelty of the Upper East Side. It meant I never had to answer to the Adelaide name again. I folded the document and slid it into the deep pocket of my black catering apron. I looked up at Wyatt Davis. The federal agent did not offer a wide smile or a dramatic speech of gratitude. Such gestures were unnecessary between us. He understood the profound psychological cost of what I had just accomplished. He knew the immense courage required to stand alone against the suffocating pressure of a family that demanded total submission. He looked at me, his eyes reflecting a deep, genuine respect for the sheer nerve I had displayed over the past 5 days. Wyatt gave me a slow, definitive nod. It was a silent acknowledgement of a successfully completed operation, a mutual recognition between two people who had dismantled a corrupt empire from the inside out. I returned the silent nod of the federal agent. It was the only farewell required. I turned my back on the wreckage of the ballroom, leaving the tactical teams to dismantle the false empire my father had built. The air behind me was thick with the harsh static of law enforcement radios and the panicked, overlapping demands of foreign investors scrambling to contact their legal counsel. I walked slowly toward the exit, my boots making soft, rhythmic sounds against the polished marble floor. I passed my sister on the way to the heavy oak doors. Victoria remained on her knees in the center of the stage, her custom silk gown designed specifically to catch the light of 1,000 society flashbulbs, now pooled around her like a crumpled parachute. Her pristine, photogenic makeup was ruined, washed away by dark, erratic streaks of mascara. She stared at the empty space where her billionaire fiancé had stood just moments prior. She was mourning the sudden, terrifying evaporation of her elite status. I walked right past her. I did not pause to offer a comforting hand or a sympathetic whisper. She had willingly offered my future as a sacrifice to secure her catering budget. I allowed her to sit alone in the ashes of her own greed. A few feet away, my mother sat rigid in a rented velvet chair near the coat check. Sylvia Adelaide was entirely catatonic. Her eyes were vacant, fixed intently on the shattered remnants of a crystal champagne flute resting near her feet. She did not blink. The matriarch, who had spent her entire adult life auditing the flaws of others, could not process a reality she could no longer command. Her social currency was gone, leaving her bankrupt in the only metric she valued. I walked past her without uttering a single word. They had spent 18 years demanding my silence, treating my voice as an irritating inconvenience. Now my silence was the only currency I owed them. It was a definitive period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. I pushed through the discreet side exit and stepped into the dimly lit service corridor. The catering staff had vanished, abandoning their staging tables and half-empty silver trays the moment the federal windbreakers appeared. The narrow hallway was deserted, offering a stark contrast to the glittering chaos I had just left behind. I walked down the carpeted hall until I reached a large decorative porcelain urn situated near the service elevator. I reached behind the ceramic base and retrieved my faded canvas duffel bag. I hoisted the heavy woven strap over my shoulder. It held my precision tools, a few changes of plain clothes, and my grandmother's original horology notebooks. It held everything of genuine value. I pressed the call button for the service elevator. The brushed steel doors parted with a soft mechanical chime. I stepped inside the empty car and pushed the button for the ground floor lobby. The doors sealed shut, locking out the final echoes of the raid. The descent began. The floor indicator numbers ticked downward in a steady glowing red sequence. 40, 35, 30. With every passing floor, the crushing atmospheric pressure of the Adelaide penthouse lifted from my chest. For my entire life, existing inside that family felt like breathing underwater. I had learned to survive by remaining perfectly still and conserving my oxygen. Now, the deeper the elevator descended, the lighter my bones felt. The descent felt exactly like shedding a heavy, suffocating skin. I was leaving behind the quiet, manipulated scapegoat. I was leaving behind the girl who shrunk away from harsh glances and calculated insults. The elevator reached the ground floor with a final settling hum. The doors opened, revealing the pristine expanse of the granite lobby. I walked past the stunned concierge desk and pushed through the heavy, revolving glass doors. I stepped out onto the Manhattan pavement. The freezing winter wind hit my face sharp and bracing. I drew a deep, unhindered breath, letting the icy air fill my lungs. The city moved around me in a chaotic blur of sensory information. Yellow cabs hissed against the cold asphalt, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Sirens wailed in the distance, a chaotic symphony echoing off the concrete canyons. Plumes of white steam rose from the subway grates, catching the neon glow of the street signs. For 18 years, this city had felt like an exclusive fortress, designed to keep people like me on the outside. It was a cutthroat, fast-paced grid dominated by my father and his predatory peers. The towering skyscrapers had always felt oppressive, casting long shadows meant to remind the ordinary citizens of their insignificance. Tonight, the skyline did not intimidate me. I tilted my head back, looking up at the illuminated steel towers piercing the night sky. The fear was gone. The people who ruled from those glass penthouses were not untouchable gods. They were just arrogant mechanics relying on faulty gears. I was not a victim of this city anymore. I was the architect who had just brought down one of the most feared titans on Wall Street. The pavement beneath my boots felt solid and grounded. I adjusted the strap of my canvas bag and began to walk. I navigated the busy avenues for 20 blocks, putting deliberate physical distance between myself and the ruined gala. I ignored the luxury boutiques with their pristine window displays and bypassed the high-end restaurants catering to the elite. I sought out the ordinary. I found a small 24-hour diner nestled on a quiet corner in Midtown. A flickering neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a warm red glow onto the damp sidewalk. I pushed the heavy glass door open. A small bell chimed, announcing my arrival. The interior was a haven of grounded, unpretentious reality. The air smelled rich and heavy, carrying the comforting scent of roasted coffee beans, frying grease, and worn synthetic leather. A few tired patrons sat hunched over their plates, entirely indifferent to my arrival. I slid into a secluded booth in the back corner. The vinyl seat creaked beneath my weight. A tired waitress wearing a faded uniform and a plastic name tag approached my table. She did not audit my posture. She did not judge the cheap fabric of the beige bridesmaid dress hiding beneath my black caterer apron. She simply placed a thick, heavy ceramic mug on the laminate table and poured a stream of dark, steaming coffee from a glass carafe. I thanked her. I wrapped my freezing hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into my numb skin. I unzipped the heavy canvas of my duffel bag. I bypassed the spare clothes and reached directly for my leather tool roll. I untied the thick cord and unfurled the protective fabric across the scarred tabletop. My precision instruments lay neatly in their designated slots, catching the diner overhead lighting. I extracted a small vintage pocket watch I had purchased from a local pawn shop a few weeks prior. The brass casing was deeply scratched, and the internal mainspring was jammed, rendering the hands frozen in time. I pulled my specialized jeweler's loop from the bag and fitted it over my right eye. The diner blurred away, replaced by the microscopic, magnified world of the watch dial. I retrieved a tiny flathead screwdriver, the textured metal handle, resting perfectly against my palm. I began to unscrew the back casing of the pocket watch. The microscopic steel screws turned with a satisfying tactile resistance. Even in the immediate aftermath of destroying a billionaire hedge fund and severing ties with my entire family, I found my most profound peace right here at this table. The gears and springs did not lie. They did not plot or manipulate. They operated on fundamental, unwavering laws of physics. If a mechanism failed, it was due to identifiable friction or a fractured component, not calculated deception. Watchmaking was an honest, dignified trade. You earned your success through patience, discipline, and unyielding focus. It was the exact antithesis of the Adelaide Empire. I set the tiny screwdriver down on the leather mat and reached deep into my coat pocket. I pulled out my mobile phone. The lock screen was crowded with a chaotic flood of notifications. Missed calls and frantic text messages poured in from distant relatives and confused acquaintances who had just seen the breaking news alerts flashing across their television screens. I ignored every single one of them. I bypassed the noise and opened my secure banking application. I navigated the menus, entering my credentials to access the portal for the newly established federally secured trust account. The loading icon spun for a brief second before the screen refreshed, displaying a clean, verified balance. $3 million. I stared at the digital numbers glowing brightly on the glass screen. My grandmother had left me this gift specifically to protect me from the very people who had tried to steal it. My father had attempted to drain it to save his fraudulent, decaying empire. My sister had attempted to consume it to impress a coward who abandoned her at the first sign of trouble. I sat in the quiet diner, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter black coffee. The dark liquid burned pleasantly against my throat. I looked at the vast sum of money sitting securely under my sole control. This wealth did not represent luxury to me. I harbored zero desire to purchase imported caviar, attend elite galas, or wear custom silk gowns. I looked at the balance and saw construction materials. The funds were heavy bricks and solid mortar. It was a towering, impenetrable wall I would build around my new life. It was the necessary capital I needed to lease a sunlit horology shop, to secure my absolute independence, and to ensure that the Adelaide family could never reach out and touch me again. 6 months is a very brief window of time for a dynasty to collapse, but gravity works with remarkable efficiency once the structural supports are removed. My father, Richard Adelaide, did not have the opportunity to negotiate a quiet, dignified settlement in a mahogany boardroom. The federal prosecutors were methodical, cold, and entirely immune to his brand of Wall Street charm. They unsealed a 40-count indictment covering wire fraud, embezzlement, and systemic securities violations. He currently awaits trial without bail, facing a mandatory decade in a federal penitentiary. I read about his arraignment in the financial section of the morning paper while sitting by a sunlit window drinking black coffee. The column detailed his sudden, haggard appearance, noting the graying hair and the ill-fitting suits he now wore to court. He had spent his entire adult life valuing pristine appearances over actual substance, and now the facade was forcibly stripped away, leaving an arrogant man shivering in the cold light of reality. The courts moved swiftly to freeze every domestic and offshore account tied to his name. The prosecutors seized the Upper East Side townhouse, the imported vehicles, and the extensive art collection to begin the long process of restitution. My mother and sister experienced a different, perhaps more agonizing kind of imprisonment. With the assets liquidated and the Adelaide name rendered permanently toxic, Sylvia and Victoria were forced to vacate the penthouse. They moved into a cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment in Queens, a borough my mother used to treat as an amusing punchline during her charity galas. Victoria's billionaire fiancé did not linger to offer emotional support or weather the storm. The heir to the global fortune officially severed their engagement the very morning after the federal raid. His family issued a sterile, legally vetted public relations statement that wished our family well during a difficult time, effectively erasing Victoria from their social registry. My sister was left with a closet full of custom silk couture she had nowhere to wear, and a digital contact list full of elites who sent her calls directly to voicemail. They tried to reach me, of course. For the first 3 weeks, my mobile phone screen lit up with relentless, frantic demands. Sylvia left lengthy voicemails oscillating between weeping pleas for financial assistance and harsh, bitter accusations about my lack of loyalty. Victoria texted frantic paragraphs of blame, furious that I had ruined her perfect narrative. I never answered a single call. I never replied to a single text. I simply walked into a neighborhood mobile carrier store, purchased a new device, and discarded the old cellular chip into a sidewalk trash bin. The silence that followed was profound and settling. I no longer had to brace myself for sharp critiques about my posture. I did not have to shrink into the shadows to make room for my sister's manufactured crises. I was finally free to occupy my own physical space. With my grandmother's trust secured in a federal escrow account, I took a small fraction of the capital and crossed the river. I found a narrow brick-lined storefront in a quiet, tree-lined Brooklyn neighborhood. The space featured tall floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the early morning light. I signed a 5-year commercial lease and hired a contractor to install sturdy oak workbenches, heavy iron shelving, and proper ventilation. I named the shop Adelaide Horology. Keeping the surname was not a tribute to my parents. It was a deliberate reclamation. I took the name they had disgraced and anchored it to honest, meticulous labor. The front room serves as a gallery showcasing restored vintage timepieces. The back room is my sanctuary. I spend my days surrounded by the rhythmic, overlapping sounds of hundreds of ticking escapements. The air always smells of brass polish, aged leather, and specialized mechanical lubricants. I set my own hours. When the heavy brass bell above the front door chimes, it is usually a local resident bringing in a grandfather's pocket watch or a tarnished heirloom found in an attic. They do not care about my pedigree or my social connections. They only care if my hands are steady enough to fix what is broken, and my hands are always steady. I sit at my oak bench, peer through my jeweler's loop, and restore order to chaotic mechanisms. If a gear is stripped, I replace it. If a mainspring is rusted, I remove the decay. I do not hide the flaws. I confront them, clean them, and restore the true balance. My father spent his life manipulating abstract numbers on digital screens, trading illusions for prestige. I trade in tangible, undeniable reality. Toxic families operate on a specific flawed logic. They confuse a child's silence with stupidity. They interpret compliance as a symptom of weakness. For 18 years, my parents looked at my quiet demeanor and saw a blank canvas they could paint their own frantic ambition over. They assumed I faded into the background because I lacked the spine to stand in the light. They never realized that the background is the most advantageous place to observe the structural integrity of the entire room. I spent my childhood mapping the stress fractures in their marriage, in their finances, and in their morals. I did not destroy the Adelaide family. That is the truth I carry with me on the rare days when the quiet feels heavy. My parents built a sprawling, arrogant mansion directly over a tectonic fault line. They used stolen funds for mortar and deception for steel. They structured their lives in a way that required a scapegoat to bear the immense, crushing weight of their sins. I was designated as the load-bearing pillar. My only offense was stepping out from under the beam. When I moved, gravity simply did the rest. The collapse was not an act of vengeance, it was an act of physics. The sun is beginning to set over Brooklyn, casting long golden shadows across my wooden floorboards. It is time to conclude the day. I stand up from my wooden stool, wipe my hands on a clean cotton cloth, and walk toward the front window. If you are listening to this and you have spent your life acting as the shock absorber for people who refuse to navigate their own potholes, hear this clearly. You do not owe your future to a family that views you as an expendable resource. Stop setting yourself on fire just to keep them warm. The moment you stop paying the ransom, you will realize how fragile their power truly is. You are allowed to pack your bags, walk out the door, and build a quiet life that belongs entirely to you. I reach up and grasp the small wooden sign hanging on the glass door. I flip the sign to face the darkening street. It reads, "Open." That is my story, a stolen trust, a federal warrant, and a watchmaker who refused to stay broken. Take care of yourselves and remember the quiet power of having the last word. We live in a culture that moves at a breathless pace, a world where the measure of a family is too often calculated by the gleam of their public image rather than the quiet warmth of their private hearth. In the heart of modern American society, where success is frequently equated with visibility and status, we find ourselves caught in a frantic current. We polish our lives for the camera, build towering expectations, and sometimes, in the blinding glare of our own ambition, we lose sight of the very people we are supposed to nurture. The tragedy of the Adelaide family is not merely a tale of corporate fraud or stolen inheritance. It is a mirror held up to the quiet, devastating ways we can fail our children when we mistake their silence for absence. Consider the dynamic of the modern household. In the relentless pursuit of worldly success, it is remarkably easy to be drawn to the glittering child. This is the child who brings home the trophies, the one who charms the relatives at Thanksgiving dinner, the one who perfectly reflects our own unfulfilled desires and social aspirations. We pour our resources into them, polishing their surface until they shine brightly enough to blind us to the shadows forming in the corners of our homes. We applaud their volume and celebrate their visibility. But what of the quiet child? The one who sits at the edge of the room, observing the machinery of the family with steady, watchful eyes. Traditional family structures often misinterpret this stillness. We assume that because a child does not demand the spotlight, they lack ambition. We confuse their lack of material hunger for a lack of intelligence. Yet true depth resides in the shadows far away from the spotlight. The quiet, unpretentious child is often the one possessing the deepest moral fortitude. They are the ones who learn to find peace not in external applause, but in the meticulous, patient work of their own hands. When we overlook the quiet child, we do not just neglect them, we dangerously underestimate the wisdom they are gathering while the rest of the house shouts. This brings us to a profound rot that can take hold in a family transactional love. In a highly competitive society, it is perilously easy to slip into the habit of treating affection as a currency. We dispense praise when a child enhances our social standing, and we withdraw it when they inconvenience us. The home becomes a balance sheet. One child becomes a blue-chip investment displayed proudly to the world, while the other is treated as a reserve tank, an asset to be drained when the primary investment falters. When love is conditional, the soul of the family starves. Children possess an innate, piercing emotional awareness. They know when they are being loved for who they are and when they are being valued for what they can provide. A traditional family structure should function as a sanctuary, a place where honesty and fairness form the bedrock of every interaction. If we teach our children that they must sing for their supper, that they must earn their right to exist in our space by reflecting our glory, we are not raising humans, we are training performers. And when the stage eventually crumbles, as all false stages do, those performers will have no solid ground to stand on. How then do we guide them toward better ground? We must teach them the dignity of honest labor and the profound power of emotional restraint. The protagonist of our story did not dismantle a corrupt empire by throwing a tantrum. She did not scream, hurl insults, or launch into hysterical monologues. She navigated betrayal through the microscopic patience of a watchmaker. She observed the truth, held her boundaries, and acted with deliberate, grounded intention. We inhabit a world that encourages immediate reactivity. We are conditioned to strike back the moment we are challenged, but true willpower is found in stillness. It is the ability to sit in a room full of chaos and maintain a steady, unbroken heartbeat. We must guide our children to find peace in tangible, truthful creation. Whether they are fixing a vintage timepiece, planting a garden, or simply sweeping a floor, there is profound moral weight in doing a task honestly and seeing it through to the end. By teaching them to value the quiet work of their own hands over the hollow manipulation of illusions, we equip them with an armor that no social rejection can pierce. Ultimately, the universe balances its own scales. A family structure built on a fault line of deception, greed, and the exploitation of its own members will inevitably collapse under its own weight. You cannot build a legacy of lasting happiness on a foundation of lies. Parents must understand that we do not need to seek vengeance on those who live immorally, nor do we need to teach our children to harbor bitterness. The natural laws of consequence are punctual and precise. The energy we pour into the foundation of our homes is the exact energy that will eventually govern them. A life built on extracting value from others ultimately leaves one entirely bankrupt of genuine human connection. To raise children with wisdom, morality, and willpower, we must first embody those traits ourselves. We must strip away the masks of ego and stop setting our children on fire simply to keep our own illusions warm. We must invite them to the dinner table as they are, not as we wish them to be, fostering a space where emotional awareness replaces rigid expectations. If this reflection resonates with the quiet corners of your own history, if you have ever felt like the invisible pillar holding up a heavy roof, know that your stillness is a profound strength. Please drop a comment sharing your own experiences and subscribe to QT Told Stories, a channel dedicated to the quiet triumphs of those who refuse to play rigged games. Tonight, when the house settles into quiet and the frantic demands of the day have faded into the hum of the refrigerator, take a moment to stand in the doorway of your child's room. Watch the steady rise and fall of their breathing in the dark. Ask yourself what kind of foundation you are laying beneath their bed. Are you building a stage for them to perform on, or a sanctuary where they can finally rest? The answer is ticking away softly in the spaces between the words you choose tomorrow.